Hello. Um, this is the second of two videos we're doing about reading um, and responding to Andrew Solomon's essay, The Closing of the American Book. This is the one that you're going to write your critical summary on. The last video we spent reading with the grain, which means reading along with something and giving it the benefit of the doubt and sort of finding ways to agree with or extend what the writer is saying. So there are some strengths to this article, and it's important to remember that because what we're going to do now is dig into some of its flaws, and there are many flaws. We're going to be reading against the grain now, right? Let me tell you this and show you this. When this article came out on July 10th, you remember that the survey about reading literature came out on July 8th, and then Andrew Solomon's article was in the New York Times on July 10th, 2 days later. Here's a packet of other articles from other newspapers. Remember, we talked about editorial pages and op-eds. Here's a series of articles that appeared in different newspapers on their op-ed pages or their editorial pages. Here's one from July 23rd in the Washington Post, August 2nd in the Christian Science Monitor, July 14th in Salon.com, and January 25th of 2005 in the Washington Post. So for months, and another one, February 12th, also in the Washington Post. So for months, there was kind of this discussion happening in the media about this, the results of the survey. People were either commenting on the survey itself, or what Andrew Solomon said about the survey, or about what somebody else said about what Andrew Solomon said about the survey. So there's this ongoing discussion, people talking about the ideas that he raised in his article. He was the first one to publicly write something about the reading survey, and that kind of kicked off this conversation. So I think that's important to know. Again, this is not just somebody put an essay in the paper and it was done. This kind of thing happens, that when there are important issues, different writers in different media outlets, newspapers and so forth, online blogs and websites, they get involved in a conversation and they're aware of what other people have said and they're responding to it and agreeing and disagreeing and so on. All right, so Closing of the American Book. It was an influential article for a little while, but that doesn't mean that it was a great article. It got people talking, lots of them criticizing him as not having a very effective argument. In general, what I might say about the flaws in his essay are that he oversimplifies. Right? There's a lot of oversimplification, and there's a lot of exaggeration. And exaggeration is really a kind of oversimplification when you present things as being one extreme or the other. You're oversimplifying things because usually things are a lot more complicated than that. Another thing is there's a lot of sloppy or careless logic. There's things that he says that if you think about him for a minute, you can see he's being careless. The survey says, the survey is a scientific study of literary reading, and you can be sure that they were pretty careful and precise. It seems as though Andrew Solomon read the results of this survey and kind of freaked out. He's I think very emotional, and it caused some distortions in his thinking. Let's. I made myself a nice long list here of things to talk about, and of course, in your paper, if you're taking notes from this video and the last one and looking the essay over yourself, you'll have lots of ideas, but you can't just list those ideas, strengths and weaknesses. You have to pull them together in some kind of a pattern, right? Group together the ones that are similar and figure out which order you're going to put them in and everything. So that's going to be your job for your paper. For my part, I'm intentionally presenting them to you only in kind of a loosely connected way. You'll need to come up with your own organization for the paper. All right, so one thing is the original study did talk about television, and it compared the reading rates of people who watch television and people who don't, the literary reading rates. So, when Solomon picks up on that, he's right to do so because it's something that the survey discussed. But all the survey said was that people who read more watch less television. Literature readers watched 2.7 hours of television each day, while people who do not read literary works watch an average of 3.1 hours daily. So the difference between 2.7 hours and 3.1 hours, that's about 15, 20 minutes. So it's not that big of a thing, right? Everybody's watching TV, but some are watching a little bit more than others. And Andrew Solomon, in his essay, seems to assume that watching television has replaced reading altogether. Okay? It's not true. He also clearly has a bias that reading is good. Seems like he thinks reading is always good, and that TV is always bad. I think that's something that it's a familiar claim in our culture that, oh, well, reading, smart people read and it's good for you. TV, it rots your brain. Well, let's think a little more carefully about it. There's a lot of bad stuff written. Just because you're reading doesn't mean you're reading something good. And there's also a lot of good stuff on television, right? I mean, just because stuff is on television doesn't mean that it's bad. There are very good TV shows. There are very good movies. There's important good news, not good news, but well produced, thoughtful news. There's all kinds of good stuff on television, and there's all kinds of bad stuff printed in books. So that's an oversimplification. He also says that we're in paragraph 4, is it? He's talking about television. It's paragraph 3. No, it's telegraph. It's paragraph 4. He says that why is it? It's the paragraph that begins. My last book was about depression. Why is it that depression is on the rise? And he says, I talk about the loneliness that comes of spending the day with the TV or the computer or video screen. So you ask him, why is depression on the rise? And he'll say, the TV and the computer and the video screen. The loneliness that comes of spending the day with the TV. Well, yeah, he's taking an exaggerated example. Somebody spending the whole day with a television by themselves, that would be kind of lonely. But do people really do that? Yes, some people do that. But most people, when they watch television, don't watch it for the whole day, and they're not always alone. He's trying to get us to imagine a single person in a darkened room spending hours and hours and hours watching television, and that does seem depressing. But I think, and probably you do too, that a lot of people don't watch TV alone. They watch it with other people, and it can be you watch it with other people on purpose because you're not just going to sit there um, silently and passively and watch the television. You plan to uh, talk while you're watching television, um, including commenting on things that are going on the screen. Right? Paragraph 3 talks about television as well. He says that electronic media, like television, by and large, invite inert reception. We talked about that in the last video. That means they sort of um, they sort of maybe even assume that you're going to sit there and just kind of receive this stuff passively. You're not going to you're going to be inactive, right? One selects the channels, but then the information comes out pre-processed. Um, so the picture is of somebody, sitting there slack-jawed, staring at a screen, kind of like you're doing right now, um, and it's mindless, right? And it's depressing. Um, he talks about the loneliness that comes of spending a day with TV or computer. Well, as I said, people get together to watch television, and often it's a very active social thing. Um, we watch TV, many of us, and comment with a lot of animation on what's going on the TV, including often one of the fun things people do with television is to watch shows that they can make fun of and point out flaws in and so forth. And that's a kind of critical thinking, and it's very active. It's not just passively receiving what's coming on the screen. Your mind is actively uh, seeking the cracks in the system. Um, Also, as I said before, there can be good television too. There are good movies and good shows, um, and you know, if we compare it with reading, this is another thing that I hope occurred to you when you were reading this. He says that, um, paragraph 4, um, I talk about the loneliness that comes of spending the day with a TV or computer or a video screen. Conversely, or on the other hand, the opposite, literary reading is an entry into dialogue. A book can be a friend talking not at you, but to you. Well, what does that mean? A book doesn't talk to you, a book actually talks to you less than a television does. I mean, you actually have a voice um, being transmitted on the television. Um, Somehow for him, um, book reading is not lonely. But isn't book reading, it has to be solitary. It has to be something you do alone. Unless one person is reading out loud to another, book reading is always solitary, right? Even if you get together with another person, let's read together, and you each have your books. Um, Even if it was the same book, you wouldn't be reading together because one person would be reading faster than the other. You wouldn't be sharing an experience. Whereas watching television very easily is a shared experience, right? So these seem like real flaws in his thinking. Um, he begins with an assumption that reading is good and television is bad, and then his thinking about both of them is distorted. Da, 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 da. Oh, this idea that in the first paragraph that readers, it's the second half of the first paragraph, readers are active while non-readers have settled into apathy. Um, if you're reading, you're active, and if you're not a reader, then you're um, you're lazy and passive, right? You don't care. Did the survey say that? It said that people who read are more likely to go to concerts, museums, charity work, sports. Um, that's not those aren't the only activities that there are. Just because people aren't doing those things, there might be other reasons why people don't do those things. It may not be that reading causes you to go out and do things like that, but it might be that people who are interested in reading are also interested in cultural events like that. That would make sense. It might be that people who have more education are going to be more interested in reading and in cultural events. And if they have an education, college education, they may have more income. A lot of those things that he describes, going to museums and concerts and sporting events, that takes money, right? Doing charity work doesn't take money, but if you have a high enough income in your family, maybe only one of you works and the other one volunteers, something like that. Right? In some ways, having money gives you the ability to do more for charity. If you have money to donate, for example, it might be fun to go to events and donate your money and have everybody congratulate you. All right, getting on a little tangent there. Let's see. Yeah, an example of his exaggerated thinking. He talks about things as being a disaster, right? We talked in the last video about how his essay is broken into, the body of the essay is broken into 3 sections. Here he's talking about crisis in health, because he's talking here about mental health, right? Depression and Alzheimer's. Page 2, he's talking about politics. It's a crisis in politics. And then below, he's talking about a crisis in education. Crisis is a strong word, right? Crisis, remember when we talked about critical thinking, and I said it's like a ball balancing on a point, right? It's going to fall one way or the other. A critic or a judge decides, is this movie good or bad? Is this person innocent or guilty? You make some kind of, decisive judgment. And a crisis is a situation that's come to some intense place where it's going to go one way or the other. Reading is declining, literary reading is declining in America, but that doesn't mean that it's at a crisis point. Right? And if we look at the first crisis that he's talking about on page 1 of his essay, the second to last paragraph says, talking about Alzheimer's, second half of the second to last paragraph, he says, there is some persuasive evidence that escalating levels of Alzheimer's disease reflect a lack of active engagement of adult minds. Well, that's true. People who use their minds more, keep them more active, are less likely to get Alzheimer's. That's a widely known piece of common knowledge that he's referring to. But notice that he's saying there is some persuasive evidence. It's not absolutely proven, right? So it's kind of soft there. But the evidence isn't that you have to be reading to avoid Alzheimer's. It says you have to have your mind actively engaged. Reading actively engages your mind, but it's not the only thing that actively engages your mind. Right? The last sentence says, the disease appears to be determined in large part by heredity and environmental stimulants. So he's saying mostly you get Alzheimer's because of your genetics and the world around you. But it seems as it seems that those who continue learning may be less likely to develop Alzheimer's. That's a pretty weak claim, right? It seems, the evidence seems to say this. It's not proven. Those who continue learning may be less likely to develop Alzheimer's. Less likely. It means you still can. This might help. That's pretty weak. And then the next sentence is, so the crisis in reading is a crisis in national health. that seems like he's somebody who's prone to exaggeration, right? I think the next one that he talks about, crisis in politics, I think that he makes a much better case about that. That if people are um, withdrawing from being engaged in politics and public life, that that can be um, that can be a disaster for us. But again, he's assuming that people are, the second paragraph of page 2, he says people are retreating from civic life to virtual life, retreating from being involved in society as a citizen, voting citizen, retreating to virtual life, meaning watching computer screens and TVs. Well, have people done that? Um, it seems to me that there's an awful lot of political engagement these days. People are paying a lot of attention to politics, um, and um, how exactly is reading literature engaging in politics? It can be, depends on what story or poem you're reading, but it's more likely that um, I mean, there are things that are more overtly political than lots of literature. So he hasn't really proven that people have withdrawn from politics. And as I said, it seems almost like the opposite, that people are paying more attention to politics these days than usual. Um, yeah, so that's an example of his what I call catastrophizing, making it seem like everything is a um, is a catastrophe or a crisis. When he talks about um, depression and TV, that's an interesting thing. He may be right, that he's suggesting in the third paragraph that television, no, it's the fourth paragraph, television causes depression, he's suggesting. And that may be true. And there is some scientific evidence that shows that the kind of light waves, or no, it goes like this: the kind of brain waves that are stimulated from watching a TV screen um, are somehow related to depression. Right? I don't know the exact details, but there is kind of a connection. Right? And the theory is that when people are hesitant to turn off the television, and we've all done that, you sit there with the remote control and you cycle through the channels, just kind of cycling around. You can do that for a long time. The studies suggest that what people are doing is they're not necessarily enjoying what they're doing, but um, they, on some level, remember that when you turn the TV off, there's this kind of drop in mood that happens, and it's a brain chemical thing, and so we're avoiding that. So there are connections between television and depression, but if somebody watches television, it doesn't necessarily make them depressed. Um, it could also, remember we talked about this before. If somebody's making a claim that X causes Y, well, ask yourself whether maybe Y could be causing X, right? Depression causes people to watch television. I'm sorry, television causes people to watch television. Television causes people to get depressed. Um, well, it could be the other way around, that if people are depressed, they watch more television. So he's saying that since the 1950s, the rate of television use has gone up and the rate of depression has gone up. Well, maybe people are watching a lot more television because they're depressed. Or, as I said, maybe some other third thing. They're depressed and watching television because they're lonely and they're, isolated for some reason. All right. Number 5 on my list here. Notice that he's saying that, look at the very first line of his essay. A survey released on Thursday reports that reading for pleasure is way down in America. is that what that's the first line of his essay. Reading for pleasure is way down in America. It didn't say that. Um, what the survey says, look at the first word of the title and the first word of the article itself, literary reading. Literary reading. Here we are, what, 25 minutes into our discussion, and I'm pointing out this very basic thing. The survey was about literature, and the survey explains what they mean by literature. It says that they asked 17,000 adults if during the previous 12 months they had read any novels, short stories, poetry, or plays in their leisure time that were not required for work or school. So they are talking about leisure reading. So he's right about reading for pleasure, but it's not just any reading, it's reading literature. Right? And so he goes off talking about how people don't read anymore. The survey doesn't say that, right? There are lots of things that people read other than novels and plays and short stories and poems. Um, there are lots of, what they call nonfiction books. They're books that are about some, historical event or a biography of somebody, or it could be about just some topic in the world. There's lots and lots of books that are nonfiction, and those are, can be challenging reading as well. Whoops, there goes my alarm. Um, that can be challenging reading as well. So that can be, as stimulating to the brain and so forth, more so than if you're reading bad literature. So, his essay is talking about reading in general. The survey did not talk about reading in general. In fact, the title of his article is The Closing of the American Book, and he keeps talking about books, but the survey didn't focus on books. You could be reading short stories or poems or plays or novels. They could be coming in book form, or they might be, um, you know, you're just reading a poem here or there, or um, a short story that you see in a magazine or something. Um, so he's sloppy with his discussion here. He wants to talk about the importance of reading, um, but that's not what the survey was about. Um, dum, 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 dum. Some other examples of um, his sloppy thinking, aside from talking about books, um, as opposed to literature. He talks about the electronic media in paragraph 3, the electronic media. And he says one selects the channels, but then the information comes out pre-processed. We talked about the fact that, well, that's sort of true, that a television screen, because it's video and audio, it it we experience it as being more like real life, and it's easy to process. You don't have to decode it the way you do written text. But he's talking about the electronic media, and when he says one selects the channels, which electronic medium is he talking about? He's not talking about the radio, because we call those stations. He's not talking about the internet, because we don't have channels. He's talking about television. So, you know, he spends the next paragraph talking about sitting alone in a dark room watching television. But um, there's another electronic medium that has taken over television, and that's, of course, the internet. Right? The internet is not watching television. You can watch videos on the internet, but um, a lot of what you do on the internet is read. Right? You're not reading book length things. Um, you don't. I don't know too many people who read books online. but there is a lot of reading, and there's also a lot of writing online. Um, if you're um, if you're communicating with somebody, texting or in a chat room or something like that, there's you enter a lot of text and you receive a lot of text. There's writing is a more active expression, he says himself, a more active um, expression than reading is, um, and so he, he acts as though the internet didn't happen. If you look at the date of this survey, it was done in 2002, and it said that the previous one had been done in 1992. What happened between 1992 and 2002 that might be very relevant here? The internet, right? In 1992, the internet was barely a thing. And then by 2002, when this survey was done, the internet dominated, right? It still dominates. And so um, it may not be television that replaced literary reading, it might be the internet. Um, there, you can find literature on the internet because you can find anything, but I would say that it's very likely that people read more now than they did in 1992, or in 2002 they were possibly reading more than they were in 1992, but they were just reading something different from literature. They're reading less literature and more of other things, right? And then it's another thing if you talk about people being politically disengaged, right? Because they're watching television, he says, and they're not engaged in civic life. Well, um, actually, a lot of people go online specifically to read about political stuff and to be active politically, to try to write letters to their elected officials, and engaging, even if it's just on social media, engaging on in talking about the president and uh, current politics and so forth. All right, so he's a sloppy thinker, right? Number 7. Ah, he's a writer, right? He tells you in paragraph 4, my last book was about depression. I told you this last time that he wrote a book about depression that was very very well reviewed. It was considered an important book, and a lot of people read it. It made him famous. It's why when he wrote an article for the New York Times, they bothered publishing it, because he's somebody that in 2002, 2004 was well known among readers, I guess. Um, so he says, I was going with this. Oh, he's a writer, right? My last book was about depression. He's a writer. So, if you look at your assignment sheet, one of the things that I suggested you do is think about who the writer is, what their identity is. Does it have any potential to prejudice them one way or another about the topic they're writing on? Sure. If he's a writer, he's somebody who values the written word. He's you couldn't really be a writer without being very interested in reading, um, and so yeah, he's somebody who is already biased in favor of books. That's the field that he went into. That doesn't mean that what he's trying to do is to get you to buy books so that you'll buy his book. I had students say that before, but that's not what he's up to. He's just, you know, um, think if you were a sports fan, um, um, you'd want other people to be excited about sports too, just because you cared about sports, and you want sports to thrive. Same thing with reading. If you like reading, well, you want other people to be into reading, so that it's a big it's a big deal in your culture. Um, okay. His bias, I think, goes beyond just sort of you know, by being biased in favor of the written word and books, but there seems to be a social class bias. Um, he's somebody who says at the top of page 2, I'll never forget seeing as a high school student on my first trip to East Berlin. Well, okay, what did he see there? He saw the plaza where Hitler and Goebbels burned books. Well, he wasn't there while they were burning books. He went and saw the plaza where that happened back before World War II. Um, his having seen the place where it happened doesn't really, that's not at all relevant to um, the fact that Hitler burned books. Why do we need to know that he was there? Well, it seems to me like he's boasting a little bit. I will never forget seeing, as a high school student, on my first trip to East Berlin. He's implying he's been there more than once, and the first time was as a high school student. Who does that? Who has multiple trips to Europe? And my high school did not take us on a class trip to Europe. So it suggests that he was raised with some money, right? And I think that there's a social class thing here. He's um, he's suggesting that people who don't read, have all these kind of the educated people are superior, right? The people who don't read are, he says, lazy, and just don't care, and they're depressed and they're getting dementia, and if you don't read, he says at one point on page 2, he says at the end of the second paragraph, you are what you read. Is that true? You are what you read? Do the things that you read form your mind? Yeah, they are, if you read a lot, then it forms a lot of your thinking. But he says, if you read nothing, then your mind withers. So if you are what you read, and some people don't read anything, then that means they're nothing, right? So readers are good, non-readers are bad. He looks down on them kind of angrily. They're lazy. Um, um, they don't care. They're not participating in society. Right. This raises another issue, which is that I think, where are we? You remember this word, I'm sure. If not from my class, some of you came into the class knowing about it. Ethos. There's what somebody says, logos. We've been doing a lot of discussion of logos here, right? We're looking at the flaws in his logic and his facts. But ethos, remember, has to do with not what's being said, but who's saying it, right? The messenger, who's saying it. In this case, I think he makes himself kind of an unlikable person, and he's not likely to win people over if he's talking about them being. Remember, he used words like apathetic, meaning they don't care, and mental atrophy, which means non-readers' brains are just shriveling up, and he doesn't have anything good to say about non-readers. It seems like there's an attack on non-readers, and that's the essay comes across as negative and complaining, and not really kind towards others. Right? A good example of his I think prejudice against readers. I'm sorry, prejudice in favor of readers and against non-readers. The very end of the third paragraph, he says, many readers watch television without peril or danger. But for those for whom television replaces reading, the consequences are far-reaching. So if you're a reader, go ahead and watch television, right? All the bad things he said all the things he said about why television is bad. Well, if you're a reader, you can still watch TV, right? It's okay for them. It doesn't harm them because they're doing their reading and getting their mental exercise. But anybody else who watches reading, it's bad, right? All right. So he's got his first trip to East Berlin, and that seems like he's kind of unpleasantly showing off. His vocabulary, I'm sure you noticed, seems like he's showing off. It could be said, a lot of the things he said could be said more directly, but it seems like he's somebody who's a little bit kind of in love with his fancy vocabulary. I'm an English teacher. I like words, but when somebody seems like they're showing off, it's not likely to, we're not just talking about whether he's a good or a bad guy, but whether, his rhetoric is effective. And if you come across as being kind of negative and unlikable and not very charitable, people won't accept what it is you're saying, even if it is well argued. And in his case, it doesn't seem like it is, right? Okay. Yeah, we did talk about the internet already. So a couple other things here. I want to remind you that there are ways in which he's what he said is right, because after we tear into the flaws of this essay, and we do that second, then I worry that students will say, oh, well, it's a bad article. Well, it is a bad article in a lot of ways, but he's got a lot of good points, and some of the basic things that he's arguing really are important, right? I mean, I said in the last video, reading is important. He says that it's the basis of civilization, and that's probably not too much of an exaggeration. It's the printed stuff that we have over the centuries. It's the record of human thinking for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's what our civilization was built on, that written down memory. It is important. On page 2 of his essay, the last 3 paragraphs, he says a number of things that are important and powerful. Middle of the third to last paragraph, he says, what's the point of having a population that can read but doesn't? That's a good point, right? If we think reading is important enough that we teach everybody to do it, but then we have a culture of people who prefer not to read, well, that's what is the point? He's right that it'd be better if people read more. He says, next sentence, we need to teach people not only how, but also why to read. That's a good point, right? We're teaching people how to read, and then as soon as they aren't being forced to, then they don't do it very much, a lot of them. The next sentence says, the struggle is not to make people read more, but to make them want to read more, right? That's a really good point. I think that's, if people liked reading, they would do it. And so there's some problem, presumably, in our education or in our culture. There's some problem that leads people not to really like reading. It very well might be, the effect of the way our school systems work, our education. So that's, a really good point. We need to make people want to read, but of course, he doesn't tell us how do you do that. You could say that's a flaw, or this is the end of his article, and he's just sort of pointing the way towards the solution. The next paragraph says the same thing. We need to make reading, which is in its essence a solitary endeavor or task, a social one as well, to encourage that great thrill of finding kinship in shared experiences of books. So he's imagining a culture where lots of people read books and then they talk about them socially, the way that people now talk about movies and television and sports and video games. If books, if literature had that kind of an audience and that kind of popularity, that would be a good thing. Again, he's right, but then how do you do that? That's the question. Finally, the last paragraph, he talks about the claim that more difficult pleasures are more rewarding. That's an important truth that he's bringing to this too, that reading takes more effort, and that's one of the reasons why we often tend to avoid it. Reading takes more effort, but it also pays back more. Right? There's a deeper satisfaction in what reading does for you, partly because of the challenge, but also partly because he's talking about books, even though the survey was about literature. He's talking about books, and to read a book takes hours and hours, or even days and days. Remember that paragraph where he talked about the loneliness of watching television all day. It's more likely that people read all day. That's a very time-consuming activity. Anyway, though it's difficult to sustain your attention and read a whole book. That's difficult, but it's also really good for you, because getting that kind of mental discipline to be able to focus for hours and hours, and books have obviously a lot more detail than can be held in a small space, and so to read a whole book, you have to pick up idea after idea after idea after idea and kind of hold them all in your head and see how they all fit together. It's more challenging, but it is also, as he says, more rewarding. There's, rewarding in the sense that it feels good, but also rewarding in the sense that you get paid off. You learn from reading. You learn a lot of things, and so that's another benefit of it. Yeah, it's a mental workout, right? Yeah, they've even done some studies of literature, of serious literature, and compared it to um, its effect on people, in comparison with reading kind of lower quality kind of stuff, or even nonfiction, and they discover that in fact higher quality literature does things to enhance your thinking. Right? Like after spending an hour reading literature, then people perform differently and better on certain mental tasks and so forth. And I don't know, I feel that after spending a day reading, I go around and I feel like my mind is stronger and sharper and faster and clearer and things like that. So reading is good for you that way. So yeah, and the other thing I mentioned in the last video is that literature in particular, usually when people talk about literature, they're primarily thinking about fiction, novels and short stories. Right? And also we could include video fiction in that, movies and television shows. Fictional stories have this benefit to them that I want to remind you about. Again, I think he's right about this. When you're reading literature, when you're reading a novel, for example, you're imagining yourself into some other experience other than your own, and that's super valuable to expand your understanding of the world, expand your experience. Without stories, you would only know your own experience, but with stories, you can imagine yourself into the place of other people and see what the world, experience what the world is like from that position. Um, and so not only do you learn all these factual details about what life is like on a fishing boat in Nova Scotia or whatever the novel's about, but also um, you're learning about how people interact, because novels are almost always about the social interactions of people, and you find out about psychology, and again you're imagining that you're not yourself, that you're somebody else, and that's very helpful for people's intellectual development and their personal development to be um, become more attuned and empathetic to other people. That's why English teachers are the most empathetic, uh, morally superior people on the planet, because we read so much literature. I'm only kidding, of course, but I sometimes think of that when they talk about how literature has this ennobling effect. And then I think, then shouldn't English teachers be the most noble people in the world? And I try, but I don't know that I'm morally superior. All right, so I think that's about it. I hope that helps. And as I said, this is a big pile of observations that I unloaded on you, and then your job will be to decide which ones are important enough to include, and which of your own ideas do you want to include, and how do you group ideas together into paragraphs. And um, um, you know, I want to emphasize, I guess, this one last thing. In the last video, I talked about having a thesis either at the end of your first paragraph or the beginning of your second paragraph that is not saying, that's saying something more than just the essay has strengths and weaknesses, because that's true of any essay. You need to have a thesis that's more specific and gives the reader a general sense of what are the strengths, the major strengths and weaknesses that your essay is going to address. Okay, with that important observation, I'm going to sign off, and after we're done with this paper, the last thing we're going to do then is watch Do the Right Thing and discuss that. So we're near the end of the semester. Monday we'll have or I should say, after I've gotten your critical summary papers in, I'll choose one and do another writer's workshop the way that I did last time. Um, but then after that, the next thing will be to watch Do the Right Thing, which I'll explain to you on Moodle. All right, take care. Be happy, be healthy. Bye.